Starts. So, good evening, everybody. Apologies for the technical hitch that we've had, and a very, very warm welcome to you all. My name is Suzanne Bargett. I'm Head of Research at the Imperial War Museum. We're being hosted by the Wiener Library for this special symposium, really in lieu of the Beyond Camps and Forced Labour Conference, which would normally have been starting around about this time. I know a lot of you in the audience know the conference well and are past attendees, but not everybody is. So I'm just going to say a few words about the conference. The first one took place in 2003, and then they happened every 3 years up until the most recent one in 2018. They've always provided a much valued platform and get together for academics, archivists, museum curators and others, all united by their interest in research into survivors of Nazi persecution. Each conference has always had a strongly international dimension, with delegates making the journey to London in successive cold Januaries, such as their dedication and keenness to be part of the community, working in this challenging but absorbing field. Interdisciplinarity is key to the conference's identity. Keynote speeches have been given by a line of very eminent scholars, and important organisations such as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Research Centre and the Arolsen Archives have been regular attenders, enriching discussions with news of emerging research resources. The conference has spawned a number of publications, the most recent being this, the Proceedings of the 2018 conference. Published last year, the volume is dedicated to the memory of the late Professor David Cesarani, a member of the organising group for many years and of course well known to all regular conference attenders. So we've had to postpone the conference twice now, very, very sadly. We asked ourselves whether it could be made to work online, but we decided against that. We know just how much face-to-face interaction matters to the delegates. So instead, we thought we'd gather everyone together to hear from a small number of experts about new international debates in Holocaust memorialisation. The online nature of this evening, of course, means that we can welcome many more people, and so there are well over 100, I believe, in the audience this evening. We have 2 sessions, each chaired by my colleagues on the advisory group, Dr. Christine Schmidt and Professor David Feldman, and then we will hear some closing words from Professor Dieter Steinert, the longest serving member of the advisory group. A few housekeeping matters. You will be kept on mute throughout the programme, but we welcome your comments and questions at any time via the chat feature. And our speakers will try to respond to as many comments and questions as possible. If you have any technical difficulties, please send a message via the chat to either Christine or Martina, and they will try to help. This event is being recorded, but your image won't appear on screen. Finally, we have enabled automated captioning for those who wish to use it, and you can toggle this on and off at the bottom of your screen. Please note that this is automated and it does not always accurately reflect the words of the speaker. So over to our first panel, and I'll hand over to my colleague Christine Schmidt from the Wiener Library, who's going to chair that. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks to everybody for joining us and for joining us at this new link. In case you've missed Suzanne's remarks and you're still coming in, this is, as she said, recorded, so you can catch up on anything you've missed so far. As Suzanne said, my name is Christine Schmidt, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, and one of the members of the organizing committee for the Beyond Camps Conference. And I'm really delighted to chair this panel on new museum initiatives in the UK and the Netherlands. And we will hear from 2 extremely knowledgeable experts on these topics. So first, discussing developments in the UK will be James Baldwin, who is Head of Content for the new Holocaust Galleries at the Imperial War Museums London. Before joining IWM, James worked as a commercial theatre producer, writer, and director with work in the West End and on national tour. He is currently completing a PhD under the Crossland Scholarship at Royal Holloway, University of London, on ideas of apocalypse in Holocaust and Cold War history. Then on the Netherlands, we will turn to Professor Emil Schrijver, who is General Director of the Jewish Cultural Quarter in Amsterdam. He is also a professor of the history of the Jewish book at the University of Amsterdam. Professor Schrijver is the curator of the private Bruginski collection of Hebrew manuscripts and printed books in Zurich, and the executive editor of the Encyclopedia of Jewish Book Cultures, which the first online volume of which was published by Brill in November of 2021. He is the chair of the board of the Association of European Jewish Museums and serves on boards and advisory committees of numerous Jewish cultural organizations in and outside the Netherlands. In October 2021, he published his first work of fiction, De Hillel Codex, a literary thriller with Prometheus Publishers. So after we hear from our two speakers, we will have some time to take your questions and comments via the chat feature. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the virtual floor over to James, who we'll hear from first on the UK.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much for asking me to be here. I'm just going to share some slides with you now. Okay, so the new galleries at Holocaust at the Imperial War Museum seek to respond to the moment in which we find ourselves, both in terms of public consciousness and awareness and specialist historical research and inquiry, two things which are not necessarily very closely aligned, as most of you will be very aware of. In fact, David Cesarani, who Suzanne mentioned, who I was fortunate enough to be taught by, described this discrepancy between public understanding and scholarship as a yawning gulf. And given that the galleries are primarily targeted at a non-specialist audience, we saw it as an important opportunity to try and close, or at least narrow, this gulf. And the opening instruction that was given to me when I first started on the job is that it's not a book on the wall. And it's actually something I've thought about a lot during my time on the project. It's whether or not it refers to both the tension, real or imagined, between academics, the public and large, but for me it also refers to the bigger issue of accepting space as a virtue and not a limitation. So the first phase of the project was concerned with establishing principles, a process that started with us within IWM and within our advisory board, chaired by the fantastic Professor Dan Stein, and with a number of experts from across the UK. And it evolved through the design process. And in conjunction with this, we spent a lot of time considering the landscape of Holocaust museology across the world, and visited as many different sites as we could and spoke to as many different people as we could. And as a result of all of that process, we began to draw up a narrative that was structured within a framework of 5 chapters, but with the intention that these chapters would remain completely opaque to visitors. So one of the key things that we were seeking to achieve with the new galleries was to challenge notions of inevitability, which to me have become quite prevalent within public understandings, or at least senses of the Holocaust, representations of the Holocaust. Early on, we defined a series of underlying themes and then worked on ways to use conceptual approaches within the design to speak to these themes. This was very much about negotiating this complex relationship between text and space, which might sound obvious, but is actually a very different thing in practice. In fact, there are far more, as I've learned, far more practical dimensions to a lot of this than a lot of the critical analysis that I'd read before I started necessarily gives consideration to. And design principles emerged as the project developed, to do with use of imagery, sizes of images, etc., use of materiality, use of fonts. But all of this, every single one of these approaches was informed by these critical underlying ideas, which really gave, to me, the whole project a sense of kind of cohesiveness and unity. The slides that follow give an insight into some of these ideas, although obviously we're not talking for too long here, so we can't get too into the weeds of it all. What I wanted to start with, however, before getting to photographs of the galleries, is to show you this, because I think it's really important to not lose sight of. The words available to us, this is the text hierarchy we worked within the galleries. The words available to us are very limited. Certainly versus the number of words that you could use in a single book. And given the vast volume for Holocaust historiography, there was a real challenge here. We started with the top tier of text, which we call sections, then subsections, captions, which you'll be familiar with, and then these dark reversed out text devices we call meta texts. We introduced these throughout the galleries to try and engage with some of the complex and very active areas of Holocaust historiography or definitions, etc. The text approach to the galleries, actually, in terms of the manifestation of aesthetic, sought to acknowledge the limits with which we were working within, and to explicitly suggest the fact that we had implotted the narrative ourselves as a set of individuals, but that different experts or specialists could enter the space and implot the information differently, and that also different specialists or historians, academics could interpret the same objects differently as well. The language of the graphics within the gallery speaks to the idea of the archive and implotment. If you visit the galleries, you'll see they're supposed to look as if they're just placed around rather than being sort of words for the ages as such. So starting with the galleries images, this is the first space that visitors enter when they come off the main, out the main kind of public space within the museum. We call this media piece here, The Presence of Absence. It's a 40-minute audiovisual piece which has sites across Europe as they exist today that somehow bear the traces of the Holocaust in one way or another. This was a really central part of one of our underlying conceptual approaches, which was about the fact that the Holocaust happened in our world. It didn't happen in an abstracted, black and white, different version of reality, you know, that's been described in certain places as Planet Auschwitz. And for us, that was really important that visitors had a really kind of visceral idea of that, sense of that immediately. And the sense of this is a history that was done to people, by people, in a reality that is as real and immediate as our own. And one which is actually very, very close to us, which we walk amongst the traces of. This piece is actually deliberately and intentionally uninterpreted in the galleries in order that the visitors can make their own sense of it in their own way. And the other thing which you'll notice in this image, for those of you who haven't been to the galleries, is that these are quite light spaces, and that's something which we continue throughout the galleries, that all of the galleries are relatively light. And the reason for doing that is that we wanted to challenge notions of inevitability, and for us there was intrinsically an issue that as soon as you walked into a space that was dark, it kind of anticipates where the narrative's going. It also, for us, served to sort of tacitly suggest, albeit unintentionally, that these things happened in the shadows, that they're in unseen places. And also we wanted visitors to feel empowered to ask questions, not to feel obliged to walk through the spaces in the sort of mournful silence that dark rooms can sometimes seem to mandate. Another really big part of the new interpretation was to problematize and challenge notions of the hegemony of the centrality of the perpetrator-defined narrative. So we started with a space before we see any swastikas or Nazi imagery. We see Jewish individuals as self-defined, and that's something that we try to do throughout the galleries. When I first started, I wanted to try and invert that paradigm entirely, and I found that actually it becomes really, really difficult to do so with a kind of a non-specialist audience. It requires too much pre-existing knowledge. That was certainly my conclusion. But nevertheless, throughout we try to find ways to challenge the centrality of the perpetrator-defined narrative. I'll talk a bit more about that, but I'm conscious of getting through quite a lot now. We were really keen to suggest that the Holocaust was a contingent history, to move away from the idea of it, what Jeffrey Alexander described as the free-floating Holocaust, uncoupled from history, and to reintegrate the Holocaust back into history, and certainly within the history of the Second World War. So throughout the galleries, there are these moments here we call these war moments. So the idea is that the Second World War galleries below, the new Second World War galleries below, almost push through the floor and anchor parts of this narrative to their own. So looking at the Holocaust is very much a contingent history. We wanted to look at the pre-war phase of the single-party state within Nazi Germany slightly differently, to move away from any idea of kind of linearity in this pre-war phase, and to suggest that there's a dialogue between different things going on at this stage in this sort of phase of ideology, and also not to shy away from ideas of the consensus dictatorship. A lot of our visitors have these preconceptions that the regime in the early years was entirely determined through fear or the use of violence, and of course, as we all know, that's not the case. We wanted to make sure that those ideas of consensus were quite explicitly positioned within the galleries. And we wanted to look at perpetration in a much more rounded way in general. So one of the things that we observed in a lot of Holocaust narratives, and this is something I know that most of you will be familiar with, that the perpetrators are defined in very kind of oversimplified ways. And there's a certain type of perpetrator that a lot of our visitors are very familiar with, but, you know, mostly the likes of kind of Amon Goeth and Schindler's List, that sort of idea. So we wanted to look at perpetration more robustly. We wanted to look at the scale and extent of collaboration and complicity within the regime. And we also wanted to kind of give perpetration a physical form. So this space here sits between rooms on the Einsatzgruppen mass shootings in Central Eastern Europe and deportations from 1942 onwards. But to me, it's very much about the relationship between the center and the periphery. And it gives an opportunity to look at the top tier of the Nazi command at this moment of the narrative, and to ensure that they have a kind of degree of ownership of the narrative at this stage. So I became quite concerned actually that Hitler and some of those people around him become quite absent in the Holocaust narratives at this stage, because obviously by design they're very rarely too close to it. To me, this is also a really good example of how space can become a really important vector of interpretation. So as I say, you see here this sort of slightly small cloistered room which is opened out into these larger spaces to do with the sort of the vast landscapes of perpetration. And that's a point that we can make experientially and as I say, immediately and viscerally, but in a way that it wouldn't be possible to do in the same way if we were writing that out on a document or in a book. So that to me is very much about what museums are able to do in a way that the other kind of linear narratives aren't necessarily. That was all I was going to talk about for now, just to get the ball rolling. I always talk too long on these things, so I tried not to do that today. But I hope that that helps to give some sort of elucidation of principles. Obviously, there's a lot more to say, but those were some of the kind of the key conceptual approaches, at least, which informed our approach to this project. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was a terrific sprint through the new exhibition and some of, as you said, some of the conceptual framing of it. I will now hand the virtual floor over to Professor Emil Schrijver. There he is. Great.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks from me as well for simply having me here. I appreciate it a lot. I will also be sharing my screen, which you will now see if all's right. Yeah, the National Holocaust Museum, as you can see, this is actually, I'm going to show you some of the renderings, our plans. We were in the midst of producing a National Holocaust Museum. And it's part of what you see at the bottom, Joods Cultureel Kwartier, the Jewish Culture Quarter of Amsterdam. And the Jewish Culture Quarter of Amsterdam is the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam, as old as 1932. The Children's Museum in the Jewish Museum, called Jewish Museum Junior. The Portuguese Synagogue, the magnificent synagogue that was the inspiration for Bevis Marx and a lot of other synagogues worldwide. The Hollandse Schouwburg, I will return to that, Dutch Theater, which is the deportation center, and the National Holocaust Museum. And these are initiatives that started 1932 for the Jewish Museum, as I mentioned. The Portuguese Synagogue is as old as 1675, but it became part of our operation 2012. The Children's Museum is an initiative started in 2006. Hollandse Schouwburg, the deportation center, is part of our operation since the early 1990s. And the National Holocaust Museum, we started thinking about around the year 2010, I would say, from the feeling that well, let's put it differently. After the Second World War, my predecessors in the museum felt that it was not right to reduce what they called Jewish history to 5 years of catastrophe. And there was a big reluctance with my predecessors to actually deal with the Holocaust history, since they would prefer to talk about more than 400 years of Jewish presence in the Netherlands. A lot of what was very peaceful. That said, with the generation of the survivors basically leaving us in the last 15 years, and the process is still going on, of course, we felt it was necessary, with the society changing and with anti-Semitism becoming at least more visible, not necessarily more present, but at least more visible, we felt it was about time that we would produce our own space in which we would deal with the Holocaust history. In 2010, we started to think about it. And in 2015, the idea for a National Holocaust Museum was presented. And in 2016, we opened what we called the first phase of the National Holocaust Museum, a very small setup in which we experimented with form, in which we raised the considerable funds necessary toward building the National Holocaust Museum. We're talking about a sum of 26.5 million euros, which at the end of the day we managed to raise privately and institutionally and on the various government levels. And we managed to keep that stage open until January of 2020, not related to COVID, but luckily shortly before the pandemic started. And we're now in the process of developing, building, rebuilding the entire National Holocaust Museum. This is where it takes place. It's near the zoo in Amsterdam. For those of you who know the place, on the left, the white building you can see and you can see the street at the bottom as well. On the left to right, the white building is the former theater, which was used as an Umschlagplatz, as the deportation center by the Nazi occupiers. And on the right-hand side, you can see the new building of the National Holocaust Museum. This is the former building as it was originally meant to be a theater, literally a theater that was used during the Second World War, and that was chosen by the occupier, by the Nazis, to be used as a deportation center, rather than, for example, the Portuguese synagogue, which was way more difficult to blind, and this had the tram running right in front of the theater. So there were many practical reasons also for the occupier to choose the theater, which is of course a closed, confined space where nobody could really see what was going on. And this is where the Jews, 46,000 Jews were basically pushed through within a period of 14 months. And this building, there were even in Holland after the war, there were even talks to start to reuse that building after the Second War as a theater again. Luckily, that didn't happen. And 1960, 1962, the place was reopened as a Holocaust Memorial, and that has been a Holocaust Memorial ever since. And we're now redesigning it. This is what it looked like in the 1960s, and this is the entrance as we now schedule it, as we now want it to be. This is the entrance space. We are going to deal only with the history of that specific space of that theater at this side of the street, because we have two sides of the streets. This is an artist's impression of what the open space will look like. I will not go into too much detail, but it's a slight divergence from its present state. And this is the building opposite the street. It's a very touching story that many of you will know, some of you will not know, which is that opposite the street, there was a Jewish kindergarten. And the children who were kept together with their parents in the theater for a few nights would often be would make a lot of noise, would not be able to sleep. And the children were sent across the street to this Jewish kindergarten to spend a night or two, and then be reunited with their parents to be sent to the camps. This was opposite. This is actually the building. If you can see my mouse, this is the building. This is the building we're talking about. No, this is the building we're talking about, and the building is no longer there. And this is a former teacher school. And the teacher school building is the building Hervormde Kweekschool, it says here, which is Protestant teacher school. This building was totally. This building is the building that we're now using as a National Holocaust Museum in a totally different form. The building is important because the children, the smallest children, the youngest children who would be crying, were making a lot of noise in the kindergarten as well. They would be across at the back of the building. There was a fence, and as soon as a system of trust developed between the Jewish director of the Jewish nursery, and the director of the Protestant teacher school, they started to give the children the opportunity to sleep in one of the classrooms for a few hours. And when after the trust between the two built up, they started a smuggling route, and through the school approximately 600 children were smuggled out of the building into hiding when, for example, the tram would be in front of the Hollandse Schouwburg, and the German guards would not be able to see the children and to see the opposite part of the street. So it's this building that we're now going to use. And contrary to what James has been talking about, for us, the fact that we are taking care of this history and dealing with this history in buildings that are actually part of the history is vital to what we do. And it's also vital to the discussion of ownership of the topic. We feel that as a Jewish culture quarter that takes responsibility for Jewish history in Amsterdam, we also have an obligation to do so. And we feel that we have the ownership to do so, I wouldn't say with a Jewish voice, but as a representative or as an institution that feels responsible for representing the Jewish experience in the public landscape. This is the original building that it looked like one of the, and this is the way it will look today. It looks after the renovation. It looks totally different now. There were extra stores put on top of it, and we'll have a totally different looks and feel once we finish it. We're now in the process of building it. We're going to cover the entire back of the building with a ground floor in which we will have various areas. This is an impression of the entrance. This is an impression of the fence that was actually in between the two buildings. So the children that would be sent from the Jewish nursery to the babies largely, that would be sent from the Jewish nursery to the Protestant teacher school were actually handed over the fence in back of the building. And it's this very spot that you're looking at. So it's the historical space that was used to understand the fate of these 600 children that had been rescued. And we tell the history here, and you can see it from the inside and you can see it from the outside. And so we want people to be able to be there at that very space where this happened. And we're not going to reconstruct it, but we're going to name it for what it is. There will be an auditorium, of course. There will be an extra space for temporary exhibitions. Our first temporary exhibition will be one on looted art, which we will do together with the Rijksmuseum on the looting of Jewish art. And we're now in the process of building it. And it doesn't look the way it should be looking, but we're in the process of building it. And this is the way it looks now, or the way it looked a couple of months ago. And this is what it will look like in the near future. If we then quickly, and then I'll finish up, Christine, if we will then quickly look at the way that we are building up the permanent exhibition, which will take place on the second and first floor of that building, after an introduction, a section on living together pre-war, a section 2 on invasion and occupation, section 3 on total exclusion, section 4 on perpetrators and organization, section 5 on deportation, the deportation system from Hollandse Schouwburg and the system within Europe, 1 on the escape and hiding and the legal arrest and on resistance. And then we go to the next floor, you go downstairs actually to the section on the transition camps, Westerbork and Vught, which are the most important transition camps, the section on murder, the section on the end of war and repatriation, and the very important section on after the war. Why do I think that is an important section? Because we felt that when we started this project, if we were to develop a National Holocaust Museum, one human life after the event, we should have an answer to the question why we're doing it now. That is something that is very vital to our understanding of the topic. So why this has never been done in the Netherlands, it's a strange idea that the only Holocaust exhibitions that were going on in the Netherlands have always been connected to one particular place, be that Westerbork, be that Vught, be that other places, but there was never a national way of dealing with this history. And our answer to this, among many other answers, is that we also want to show to today's audience what has been the effect of this event on today's society, or on, let's say, post-war society in general. So we think this post-war section 11 is very, very important and vital to our conception of this Holocaust Museum, and also our programming, which is a very big part of what we're doing there. Our programming is also a vital element of what we're doing. Let me show you 1 or 2 slides more to give you an impression 2 slides more to give you an impression, because it responds in a way to my predecessor's remarks, which is this, first of all, this aspect of the humans doing this to other human beings. This is a very famous picture. It's a little boy by the name of Sieg Maandag. He survived the war. This is shortly after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. It's a 7-year-old boy walking around Bergen-Belsen. The corpses of the dead bodies of the people who were murdered are still there. He's wearing clothing that was given to him by British soldiers. This picture appeared in Time magazine after the war, and he was identified based on this picture by family members of his in the US who saw Time magazine and who identified the little boy. This is the picture that people will be the first people that pictures see, and in back of it we will have the destruction of Europe. So that's the start of the exhibition. So you get the very personal, striking, shocking image of this little boy who has to deal with what he just went through for the last couple of months at least. And on the other hand, you can see the destruction of Europe. And then we enter into the exhibition. So we were looking for a way to pull people into the exhibition and to demand them to think about the human dimension. The other thing is something I think is also very important. This is section 3 on anti-Jewish measures, on exclusion. This is the full card catalog of the Jewish Council, the Joodse Raad, which is now owned by us, 140,000 cards. And I wanted to show this also because we, just as London, we wanted to break with the traditional color of Holocaust exhibitions. Many of the Holocaust exhibitions that you will see are dark brown spaces. And what we want to do is that we want people to have light spaces. We want them also to be able to look outside the window. We want them to be aware of the fact that this was happening in full daylight rather than in a dark tunnel in which you're almost forced into feeling something before you actually see what you are supposed to be seeing. So this is very important. And on the wall is something that is not happening in all spaces. It will not be on all the walls, but these are the ordinances, the official ordinances of the Nazi occupiers that they issued in order to give all their acts a legal basis. Something that people are not aware of is that the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands took place within a legal framework that was first created. And we will have all these measurements on the wall, confronting people with what was actually necessary to get where it ended. This is basically my presentation. I have the same issue that my predecessor has, which is that it could go on forever. But I will stop sharing the screen, and I think we can start the discussion. So a little bit more than 12, Christine, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you. I'm just going to add James back into the conversation as well. And because Emil had the advantage of hearing you first, James, I just wondered if you wanted to make any comment, because obviously there were some commonalities and some differences, particularly in terms of the types of space that you're doing your 2 exhibitions in. So I just wondered if you wanted to say a bit before we take any questions or comments from the audience. Please feel free to put those into the chat whenever whenever they strike you. So James.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. I suppose it's exactly as Emil said. What is so significantly different about the 2 projects are the places that they're located in terms of the specific buildings that surround them. And I think it's one of the things which we started to think about a lot as our work on the project evolved. Certainly going, to sites of persecution or sites that have a kind of a very direct relationship to the events clearly informs a completely different approach. And I think for us that's something which we were constantly trying to sort of reconcile. So we had the sort of the diametric opposite challenge in a way that essentially our building has nothing to do with these events at all. So we interestingly did the exact opposite. As Emil was talking about how opening the building out to sort of create a dialogue with the landscape that surrounds it, we deliberately closed the walls in, and our design conceit was actually that the walls become like a cyclorama. As you said, my background's in theatre, so I realized as we went on that my approach was actually really Brechtian, which is the way that I always used to direct shows as well, and that the walls are supposed to, there's as a sort of a concept to the approach, and we ended up breaking this in a few different places because practical issues got in the way. But if you go to the galleries, you'll see that virtually nothing is ever mounted off the walls. Everything is mounted off the set work structures, because the walls are supposed to be sort of an anonymous presence that recedes into the background, almost sort of infinite space, and then the design sits within it. So I think to me that's really interesting. I'm also interested, obviously, that kind of independently we've both sort of arrived at similar conclusions to do with you know, the use of light and the kind of the problem of darkness. Although obviously one can well understand why darkness has seemed traditionally to be, you know, an appropriate way to engage with the subjects. And just one other thing really quickly, I think Emil's point about the aftermath, we call it afterwards, that section, I thought that was really, that's really important. We'd say same thing actually, our narrative carries through beyond what we call survival, you know, so beyond, you know, narratives of liberation into questions of kind of, you know, what happens after that, and then sort of legacy issues. And we try quite hard to not put any kind of endings on things, to be quite clear that this is something which kind of goes on and is not something that can be kind of tidied up into a sort of a text panel, like a sort of a figurative full stop at the end. So I think that's I think that's really interesting as well. Yeah.
Thank you. We've had a couple questions come in now from the chat. The first one I think is directed, it came in when Emil, you were speaking. It's a very quick question. When will the museum renovation be completed? You might have said it at the beginning. Is it 20?
I mean, I actually may not have said it at the beginning. I realized when I was looking at my notes. Depending on so the buildings will be ready January 2023. So in a year, exactly a year from now, and depending on the final decision that we make on the installation of the permanent exhibition, we will decide whether we will be able to have it installed by June, or if it's going to be July, we will open in September. And that is a decision that we will make next month when we have our a more final design for the entire permanent exhibition. It's just a very practical matter. So the building is on schedule and ready to be delivered in January of next year, exactly a year from now. But then depending on how big the installation is actually going to be, and not wanting to push things only to be open before summer, it may be either June or September 2023.
Thank you.
And we'll be the two buildings. It will be the two buildings.
Right. Another question about, for both of you, if you say anything in your museums about Yiddish, which of course was the language of the majority of those murdered, and which arguably suffered a similar fate, same fate to the speakers. So that's a question for both.
Yeah, we actually, one of the things which I was really mindful of when we started on the whole project was that, but also this kind of, and a few scholars have written around this, which really kind of informed my thinking, that the kind of which victims we're talking about here, to not kind of over define people targeted and killed in the Holocaust as Western European Jewish people, which is clearly something which has happened in a lot of museums that we've been to, and to try and represent Eastern European Jewish experience and Yiddish as well, obviously. So we display a Yiddish typewriter which is on loan from the Jewish Museum in London within the opening section, and talk a little about Yiddish then, and then throughout the galleries too, as is ever the case with these things. As I mentioned with the text, obviously one would want to say so much more than one can, but obviously objects for us as a museum are really, you know, they're kind of at the core of what we do, and this you know, this really fantastic object, this typewriter. In fact, we were over in New York just before lockdown, and saw an exhibition of Yiddish typewriters over there as well, which really kind of got us thinking as well. But it's something we consulted a lot about. We spoke to a lot of, in fact, as part of the project, I should just say too, we've been very lucky to have benefited from the contribution or the input of a number of different representatives from different religious communities, Jewish religious communities, but one rabbi in particular, Rabbi Nicky Liss, who's worked with us really, really closely on the project. No, this is not necessarily related to Yiddish in particular, but the question of kind of the representation of experience in a really meaningful way. So with Rabbi Nicky was put a lot of the objects, religious objects, in the case himself, so that we had confidence that they were being displayed in a way which was kind of appropriate and considerate. But also he went through all of the text with us relating to religious practice beforehand, and that's something we tried to do as much as possible to Jewish experience, to make sure that we weren't kind of speaking on behalf of, that we were doing that as well as we could. I hope that answers the question a bit.
I think for us the issue of Yiddish is slightly different. We have decided to be a national Holocaust museum, so to be a Holocaust museum that deals with the experience of the Jews in the Netherlands. And Yiddish in the Netherlands disappeared in the mid-19th century as the lingua franca of the Jews. So it has only small relevance to the. It was already nostalgia for the large majority of Dutch Jewry in the generation before the war. So Yiddish as the lingua franca of the Jews in the Netherlands is no longer relevant in the let's say in the 20s and 30s of the 20th century. We deal with three different levels of geography, I would say. First of all, we on the ground floors of both buildings we deal with the experience of what was taking place on these historical sites. Second, of course, we deal with what happened in the Netherlands, and then, of course, you have to take it into the European global dimension of the Second World War, if only for the fact that the people were moved there and were transported there and were murdered there. So Yiddish is less relevant to the way that we develop the narrative, but if you talk about something like the Holocaust by bullets, many people who did everything that went on in the Ukraine and all these places in Eastern Europe, the murder of 1.3 million Jews, not in gas chambers, but otherwise by bullet, that is something that also happened to a lot of people who had fled to the Netherlands already in the 1930s, family members of a lot of people who had fled to the Netherlands already in the 1930s. So there is a big relevance of what's going on in Eastern Europe, but what we want to counter the traditional view of European Jewry as a ghettoized group of people who were gathered as a foreigner in a society, because one of the big issues in the Netherlands is the enormous level of assimilation of Dutch Jewry in the 1920s and 30s in the 20th century, and many people who would no longer define themselves necessarily primarily as Jewish were redefined as becoming a Jew only, and were murdered because of that. So that is something that is really different, and people were walking in the streets of Amsterdam while other Jews were still walking in the streets of Amsterdam, while at the same time in Eastern Europe, a totally different process were going on. So our role, our task is to counter that traditional image, which overtakes the entire conception of what was going on in the Holocaust. So we have a different approach to that.
Thanks both. I am conscious of time. We have another panel that's patiently waiting its turn to come. But I thought maybe I could just take one last question, and then maybe if you have a moment during the second panel, you could maybe chat with some of the other participants who are asking, if you can. But Rachel's asking, James specifically, you mentioned that pre-existing knowledge or lack of works against museum goers seeing Jewish Germans as anything other than victims, if she understood your point correctly, and if she wondered if you could expand on that a bit.
Sorry, say that again.
So she said, if I understood correctly, you said that pre-existing knowledge or lack of knowledge works against museum goers seeing Jewish Germans as anything other than victims. And she wondered if you could expand or correct.
Oh, I see.
If that's not the right.
No, sorry, that wasn't quite the point I was making. I think what the point I was trying to make is that I suppose obviously there's been research projects that have identified this, and obviously just anecdotally, I think it's something which we're all fairly familiar with, that most people's knowledge of the Holocaust as they enter the spaces now is kind of over defined and centered around a certain set of ideas, sort of as what Emil was just talking about there as well. And and we were really mindful of the over characterization of certain dimensions of the Holocaust, conditioned through, let's face it, a very short list of films which most of us could name, and other kind of things like that. And so we were really mindful of trying to not myth bust as such, but trying to challenge those often, not always, but often incorrect or at least over-defined ideas. So, exactly as Mill was just saying there, actually, I think in terms of sort of pre-war Jewish life in Germany, for example, what's one of the things that students say all the time is, if you say to them how many Jewish people living in Germany before the war, the answer is always like 20%, 30%. It must have been a hugely dominant, and then to sort of say, well, no, it's not. But actually, even then, within that, we have objects from families within the collections who were persecuted as Jews, but never identified as Jewish themselves. So we don't even include them in the pre-war section, because from our point of view, if they didn't live or identify as Jewish, then nor should we define them on those terms either. And so I think it's a hugely kind of complex issue. But I think in terms of the pre-existing knowledge, I think most of our visitors entering the galleries have a sense that somehow in the 1920s, maybe 1930s, Hitler created this idea to kill Jews across Europe. And as soon as the war started, somehow through trains, concentration camps, death factories, this happened. And I think throughout, we tried to work in a way which was cognizant of those pre-existing things, but to challenge them. And exactly as Mill was talking about, things like the anti-Scriptum mass shootings in Central Eastern Europe, they're just not particularly understood by a huge number of people coming into the galleries. And also, I think, you should have said earlier on, one of the things we try to work against as well is the over-characterization of the Holocaust as somehow the apotheosis of industrialized mass murder. To be quite clear about the fact the Holocaust was quite clearly very messy and very dirty and very barbaric and very brutal. And I think some of the discourse in certain vectors of literature talking about factories of death somehow seems to suggest that the Nazis created a highly efficient system which was just set in motion and then somehow by virtue of its own momentum killed millions of people in a way which was quite clean and quite well organized and quite sanitized. And we tried to sort of remove any of those ideas aesthetically and interpretively from within the gallery. So I know that's answering a slightly different question, but I think the question of pre-existing knowledge is really important, because it's not that people come into the galleries with no knowledge, it's that they come into the galleries with a very specific type of knowledge, and that's something which we try to think about. And I think in terms of this, what I was trying to say is that what we don't want people to do is to walk in and see Jewish people and just think about them as victims. Everything that we were trying to do within the galleries was to problematize and challenge that notion that these people somehow exist as victims. In fact, Professor Tony Kushner, who sat on our advisory board, made this point in one of the first meetings, which really stuck with me, about just the way of kind of phrasing it. He said it's really important that visitors understand that the chronology of people killed in the Holocaust is not the chronology of the people that killed them. And so throughout, we tried to find ways to sort of pull those two things apart, and not just to talk about people who were killed as victims, but to talk about them as people, to the extent that it's possible to do so in any sort of space. Obviously, lives are so infinitely complex, but nevertheless, to at least challenge that. So that I hope that sort of answers the question.
Thanks, James. Thanks. I think, unfortunately, although we have really fascinating questions in the chat, we've run out of time for this panel. We started a bit late, so we will be going, I'm sure, a bit over. Hopefully our speakers can stay with us in panel 2, but I wanted to thank both Emil and James for this fascinating, really quick peek into the initiatives in both the UK and the Netherlands. And I'm going to hand it over to Professor David Feldman, who's going to take us into the next panel. You can just stay right here for the next panel. You don't need a new link, thankfully. Somebody's asked me that. So, okay, handing it over to you, David.
Thank you, Christine. And yes, it's my honor and my task to introduce our second panel, which is on recent debates on Holocaust memorialization in Germany and in Poland. And I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who is Jennifer Evans, professor in history. The research interests are in the history of sexuality and visual culture, and especially the role of photography and social media as agents of historical meaning. Her first book was Life Among the Ruins, Cityscape and Sexuality in Cold War Berlin. She has edited a book with my friend and colleague Matt Cook on queer cities, queer cultures in Europe since 1945. And there's a forthcoming co-authored book on Holocaust memory in the digital mediascape. So Jennifer, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being my first workshop conference of 2022. Maybe it's the same for hopefully it's the same for everybody, unless you were working over the holidays. I'm very pleased to be here to speak to you a little bit this evening or this afternoon in terms of my time. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, Canada, and it is the unceded and traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. I acknowledge the land and my relationship to it as a settler, not just as a form of ceremony, but as a constant and living reminder of the work of remembrance and genocide. I had the great fortune of having listened to Elder Ted Fontaine speak on the issue of residential schools and reconciliation before he passed late last year. And we had hoped to invite him to speak at Lessons and Legacies, which some of you know is one of the largest Holocaust history and memory conferences organized out of Northwestern's Holocaust Education Foundation. We had wanted him to speak together with his close friend, Nate Leipziger. Both men were survivors of race hatred, and they had developed a language around which to speak to their shared experiences that recognized what drove the eliminationist policies of, in this case, Canada and Germany, noting at the same time fundamental differences and distinctions. Well, in Germany today, similar conversations around the legacy of colonial violence and the place of the Holocaust are not so easy to come by. And we witnessed this past summer in what has been variously called the Catechism debate, or even Historischer Streit 2.0, given the way that it evolved in online publications and on social media. And I'm just going to share my screen because that will allow us to see some of that in action. So you should be able to see the subject that I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. And of course, for those that don't know, although I'm sure many of you do, the first Historischer Streit was in the 1980s and waged around the singularity of the Holocaust, that Germany bore special responsibility for the Shoah in the face of right-leaning historians who wished to argue that German violence was akin to Soviet violence, hence minimizing German crimes. Part of this recent memory debate in Germany is intensely German. That is, it is about a specific set of issues in the German public sphere. But it is also a shared experience as national histories the world over have started confronting in various ways, in some cases in fits and starts, the legacy and continued impact of anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia in our shared worlds. This heightened sensitivity around national history and the lessons of the Holocaust owes much to the rise of populism and illiberalism in many quarters that questions received histories of pluralism and multiculturalism. And the Holocaust, after all, has a central place in many national memory cultures, not just in Germany. As Daniel Levy and Nathan Schneider have influentially argued, Holocaust memory has become linked with a form of cosmopolitan memory and a universal regime of human rights. But I don't think it would be wrong to say that recent events have shaken us all a bit from our belief that we have somehow emerged from the 20th century on the other side. Part of this sense of nervousness, of circumspection, owes to living in the wake, of course, of the George Floyd killing and the questions it has raised around ongoing examples of structural racism in democracies. Part of it comes in response to the ease with which far-right groups and ideas seem to manifest, sometimes easily, in Western democracies, let alone in authoritarian ones. Part of it is owed to the ongoing human rights challenges in the Middle East and the waves of unrest and migration in the Mediterranean. And part of it comes too out of efforts to shine a light on the violence of the 19th century and its place in the history of genocides to come. In other words, there are many different vectors that have asked us to think critically and comparatively about the lessons we believe we have learned from the Holocaust. This summer, things came to a head in Germany over how to think about many of these same issues, which begs the question, why now or why then, as we are now about 6 or 7 months out from it. Although the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, Susan Neiman, would write in her 2019 book, Learning from Germans, that there were important lessons to learn from Germany around how it had come to terms with its violent past, there were hints and suggestions that all was not well within German memory culture, especially around how to take into account some of these same vectors and issues I noted a second ago. There was no doubt that Germany had taken great strides towards Holocaust memory and education, but generations after the Shoah, in a multicultural nation, some scholars, activists, and journalists began raising questions about just how well Holocaust consciousness was indeed translating into anti-racist commitments in other areas. Often this voiced itself around issues of comparison, how to think about the history of the Holocaust together with other forms of past and ongoing schisms in society, especially around race. If the Holocaust provides Germans with a sense of collective responsibility to protect universal values, how should we think of ongoing examples of racial inequality today? So this flared in many different ways and many different places and spaces. And one of those places is here on your screen in the pages of the online Swiss magazine Geschichte der Gegenwart in Dirk Moses's polemic, the German Catechism. But before this summer, there already was a kind of a cauldron of ideas, fermenting. There were already, of course, the charges of anti-Semitism against the noted African theorist Akhil Membe in 2020 for arguments he had made suggesting the Israeli occupation of Palestine was a form of apartheid. This was taken up by critics as a form of Holocaust minimalization or relativization. The question becomes, why did this Membe affair ignite in the way that it did in that moment? When, just as an example from the headlines this last week, we learned or remembered or recalled that Desmond Tutu also made similar comparative arguments in the 1990s. So why did the Membe affair ignite such a reaction? A second place where we see fissures in the German memorial landscape was over the translation of Michael Rothberg's 10-year-old book, Multidimensional Memory. Rothberg is a professor of Holocaust studies, English and comparative literature at UCLA, and he published his book to much acclaim in memory studies circles, especially for his arguments around how Holocaust memory gave a language and a framework that was taken up by human rights and decolonial civil rights movements for their own purposes. The confrontation of memory regimes, he argued, produced more Holocaust memory while equipping other folks in their struggles as well. His book was slated for translation in Germany, and this unleashed a wave of newspaper articles that claimed his work was similarly minimizing or relativizing the Holocaust through comparison. A third site of contestation around memory was around the reconstruction of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, and also the debate around possible restitution for the Namibian genocide. These debates around what to do with colonial treasures and how to think about the history of German colonialism itself, which was not very well known in Germany, despite arguments that Holocaust memory had occasioned a memory boom in recent years. This too was swirling in the background these last few months leading up to the summer. There were countless newspaper articles in the German feuilleton that raised the question of structural continuities, both between the 19th century and the Holocaust. So did colonial violence put in place structures of thinking and operation that would help unleash the Holocaust? Or also in terms of structural continuities to today. around an inability to actually think about the place of German colonial violence within, today's Germany. Here too, we saw a number of alarm bells around relativization and minimization directed against scholars like Jürgen Zimmerer, who argued for, this very nuanced sort of looking back to the 19th century. It's in this context that a polemical piece by the genocide scholar Dirk Moses ignited a powder keg. Titled The German Catechism, which you see here. I'm just gonna go down to this part of his text, and published in this Swiss online magazine, and later in English on the New Fascism syllabus, which I co-curate. Moses outlined several aspects of German memory culture that he believed prohibited a fulsome reckoning with the deep history of German violence. And this included thinking about the Holocaust comparatively in its many different frames. Well, why did this piece unleash what some have called Historischer Streit 2.0? Well, and there were many different reasons which were explored and are continuing to be explored by journalists, by scholars, and now by students in their classroom, which will be an interesting thing to take stock of. I think for a couple core reasons, and in the interest of time, I'll just summarize them. Moses's catechism called into question the notion that Germans had indeed built a successful, productive, and multifaceted memory culture. Moses suggested in very pointed terms that what we are actually seeing in today's Germany is not just a reluctance to deal with race, but an outright inability to speak to parallel and ongoing experiences of marginalization, many that continued to the present day. And one of Moses's most controversial points was his charge that Holocaust memory culture had actually been instrumentalized. And here he was speaking chiefly to journalists and some politicians for the way he believed it silenced critics of racism in Germany, and also German stances on the Israeli occupation. As you might imagine, this unleashed a torrent of commentary in German newspapers and on Twitter. And it was here that the New Fascism syllabus kind of came into play. Upon reading this very explosive text, I instantly saw a possibility to enlarge the playing field and bring a number of different voices into the conversation. My fear was that it might end up just being a very explosive tit for tat between a couple of core voices, which, it did actually become for the large part. But our New Fascism syllabus, which you can see here, and I'll put some of these, I'll put the URLs in the chat a little bit later. The conversation that was curated on the New Fascism syllabus was an attempt to really keep many of these different balls in play, many of the different issues around memory from various different perspectives, from junior colleagues to senior colleagues, from activists to memory producers. This was the thinking behind the curated conversation on the New Fascism syllabus. And what came of it was actually quite amazing. Whereas the German scholarly and media reaction had centered around a few voices, mostly men of a certain generation, our debate was indeed multifaceted, bringing younger and older scholars together in one forum, experts in African history, Black and queer history, as well as scholars of German history, memory, and culture critique, Germans and European and North Americans, I should say. And they came at Moses's text from a variety of angles and perspectives. Some expressed outrage at what they saw as Moses's neglect of the very hard-won and difficult work of memory activists in the post-war period, who wedged a space for Jewish victimhood in extremely hostile terrain. Some took issue with the religiosity of his piece, his religious language, the tone, and the underlying assumptions. Others worried he was doing the work of the right in undermining the fragile place of the Holocaust still and increasingly 70 years after World War II. Others, though, saw Moses's piece, however vitriolic, as opening the door to important issues that were not yet salonfähig in polite society, but were of deep importance to memory activists on the ground in Germany. How should we reconcile the place of Islamophobia in today's Germany, as an example? What about the blind spots around anti-Black racism? And what should we make of the chill in public discourse around those who are critical of events in the Middle East? Our portion of the Historischer Streit 2.0 debate on the new fascism syllabus opened up, I think, the conversation to issues and methodologies circulating in the Anglo-American world, which were not always present in the German landscape. We showed that the public memory of the Holocaust in Germany is fraught, maybe now more than ever, but hopefully productively so, and that there are a host of issues that require our attention going forward. Let me just point to some of those before concluding. German memory debates are, of course, inherently global. We see that here more than ever, and yet this debate neglected and still neglects a broader focus. One place we might think about that would be in thinking about the East. There are a number of Southeastern and Eastern European scholars who feel like they too have work to do in thinking about sort of the public memory of the Holocaust. Lost in this debate too was the role of the GDR and East German memory culture and what role it played and continues to play in how multicultural Germany confronts its past. As the global historian Sebastian Comrade noted in a follow-up piece in Mercure, we need to recognize that globalization has had an impact on German memory formation, be that in terms of new Germans and the memorial traditions, and maybe even the violence that they bring with them in terms of memories, their own experiences as well, of course, of inequality in contemporary Germany. We need to ensure the debates around memory bring in a variety of actors and generations, since their perspectives are critical to ensuring a robust and polyvocal public sphere. And I think we also have to recognize that, and we need a more complex way of thinking about the role of social media as not just the sort of doom and gloom and end times that it's often rightfully so seen as, but that it can also be a space or a place of robust, scholarly, important conversations that in some cases are not always happening in the sort of more mainstream places, in this case, in the German newspapers and the contemporary media sphere. So there was a lot that happened this summer that is chronicled on the New Fascism syllabus. And if anyone is interested, this is available still today, the various, I think it's 13 contributions that were part of this larger debate that is still ongoing in Germany. But I'll stop there since I've spoken long enough.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for a really clear and illuminating survey of what is a crucially important debate. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'll just say that, as before, please do place any questions or comments that you have in the chat, and we'll get to them as much as time allows. And speaking of time, we sort of started 20 minutes late, and I'll try to keep us to sort of 20 minutes behind schedule. Our second speaker in this session is Dariusz Stolar. Dariusz was director of Polin, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, between 2014 and 2019, and he is now a professor at the Institute for Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. He has written 6 books himself, had a part in 4 co-edited volumes, and has produced over 100 scholarly articles. He really is someone who was brought up in the shadow of Stakhanov. But more important, I've never heard Dariusz speak without coming away understanding more about the past and the present. So I hope you won't let me down on this occasion, Dariusz. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, David, for this generous introduction, and I'm really glad to be here with you. When listening to James and to Eric, Emil, at the beginning, I thought that I could start my presentation similarly about the new investment in new memorials being built in Poland. And there are ongoing projects, major projects. We have just opened a year ago a new memorial of the Sobibor death camp. And the content of the exhibition was designed with assistance of very decent historians, my colleagues. We have under construction a museum in Płaszów, a concentration camp near Krakow. And we have Treblinka, the process of building a proper museum in the Treblinka death camp, the second largest death camp that the Nazi built in occupied Poland, undergoing. We have a new museum of the Warsaw Ghetto opened, well, under construction. It exists as an institution, doesn't exist yet materially. But here, when I come to the Warsaw Ghetto museum, I must change my tone and realize that this is not the whole story. Actually, this is not the most important part of what is going on in Poland in terms of the debates on the past. We are not discussing anymore, as we did a few years ago, what are the adequate and the appropriate curatorial strategies to represent the violent past in the various, highly nuanced topic that the booming Holocaust research in Poland was providing to the museums. For 6 years now, we have been mostly busy defending contemporary history and the Holocaust history in particular against our own government and against various right-wing forces united with this government, sometimes lavishly funded by this government, which are trying to basically distort the past. And let me refer to what James said at the beginning, that there is a gap between the popular understanding and certain knowledge of the Holocaust and what the scholarship provides, the knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust that scholars have developed in the past decades. So the same is in Poland. And the difference is that in the 1990s and sometime up to 2015, we were doing a lot of efforts to bridge the gap by educating the general public about what the historians have accumulated in terms of the knowledge of the Holocaust. Now it's the opposite. Now the government is trying to force the historians to follow the understanding of the past of the constituencies of the ruling party. And they have some strange ideas about what was the Holocaust, what was the behavior of the non-Jewish Poles, and so on. So instead of discussing what should be the proper exhibition in the new memorial museum in Treblinka, huge death camp, some 100 kilometers east of Warsaw. For example, this month, we had a major scandal with a memorial plaque, a small monument erected in the village of Treblinka, a few miles away from the site of the death camp, which was erected by Pilecki Institute, one of the new institutions established by the populist party to educate about the glorious history of Poland, which is to commemorate a single Polish Christian who allegedly was killed by the Germans for bringing water to the Jews who were packed in the train waiting at the railroad siding in this village. When we started to investigate the story, a little bit shocked that in a place of massive Jewish suffering, that a single Christian was commemorated, we realized that the whole story is based on a single account of one man given in the 1980s, 40 years after the war. And this is the whole basis for alleged heroic act of this man. We don't know if he was heroic or not, but if you can make a monument on the basis of a single account of unknown quality and reliability, it shows how much the government is determined to produce and commemorate the glorious past of Poland, rather than to support the critical historical investigation of this past, which was one of the major achievements of democratic Poland since 1989. So I see the last years when we almost constantly have a kind of, maybe not a debate, because for me a public debate is something that is to lead to a shared understanding of the past, to shared conclusions. Now we have controversies going mostly online, or they are misrepresented in the major media, which are not to lead to any shared conclusion. And they are basically, at least some of them, are to intimidate scholars. So the most disturbing event was the trial of two of our colleagues, leading historians of the Holocaust in Poland, Professor Engelking and Professor Grabowski, which was they were sued by a relative of a person they described in the book, and they claimed that this person who was a village elder in Eastern Poland, by the account of a Jewish survivor, he was involved in hunting the Jews in the forest, but also he helped her at another moment. So they were sued for allegedly misrepresenting him. And eventually things ended relatively well because the appeal court in Warsaw decided that the whole case is not acceptable for the court, that this is restricting the freedom of academic research, and the case was rejected. But the story of the trial was basically to show and teach historians, especially young historians, but also teachers, journalists, media people, that they should think twice before investigating such topics, and they should be really careful writing anything about it. And that was a follow-up of something you have probably heard about. In 2018, Polish government suddenly rushed through the parliament a new law, which is abroad known as the Holocaust Complexity Law, which was to penalize with 3 years in jail for some statements on alleged complicity of the Polish state or the Polish nation in Nazi crimes during the Second World War. And of course, Polish state was not involved in Nazi crimes. Poland as a state was fighting Nazi Germany since the first day of war to the last day of war. But we don't know who is the Polish nation. If 3 Poles killed a Jew during the war, was it enough to say that Poles were involved in Nazi crimes? So the muddy wording of this law was deliberate, exactly to produce a chilling effect. Eventually, the law was abrogated under international pressure, mostly from Israel and the United States. The government backed off and removed the most controversial clauses. Some controversial clauses still there remains, but the chilling effect was already there, and it's there. The chilling effect means that I am afraid that many people, especially young scholars, really think twice before they decide to become Holocaust scholar. There are so many interesting topics that are not so dangerous, that are not as risky as researching, especially the Polish-Jewish relations during the Second World War. The problem of the chilling effect is you don't see it, because you cannot count how many articles were not written, how many exhibitions were not opened, how many new projects were not submitted to granting agencies. This is the unwritten books are the effect of the chilling effect of the chilling effect of this law. But I'm pretty sure it's there. Another victim of the last 6 years of the populist government is deploralization of memory. One of the achievements of early democratic Poland in the 1990s was the emergence of the plurality of voices about the past. The idea that there is no monopoly of the government as it had been under the communist regime, that various groups, institutions, media, churches, local governments may have a variety of opinions about the past, and they have a right for their voice in the public arena. And that was a great achievement of Polish democracy, and it was also an important factor shaping Polish democracy. We had some 14 major debates on the Holocaust in Poland. The biggest of them was in early 2000s, following the publication of a book by Professor Jan Tomasz Gross, The Neighbors, on the mass killing of Jews in the small town of Jedwabne in eastern Poland in the summer of 1941, committed largely, not only, but largely by the Polish Christian neighbors, which, by the way, was not only the biggest Polish debate on the Holocaust, it was the biggest Polish debate on history ever. And it had far-reaching effects, including important films. You may have seen Ida, a great black and white film, which clearly was a fruit of this debate. To some extent, it contributed to the founding of the Polin Museum. The debate was 2000-2002. The Polin Museum was established as a public-private partnership in 2005, and then we opened the core exhibition in 2014. And the expansion of the Holocaust research in Polish academia, a new generation of scholars, much better than I was as a young man when I decided to study the Holocaust in late 1980s. So we had a plurality of voices, a certain harmony between the political leaders of Poland and the grassroots bottom-up initiatives to commemorate. In hundreds of towns, really small places, there were plaques erected, small memorials made, lectures, educational programs, Jewish cemeteries cleared. So there was a certain harmony, maybe not complete unity, but at least there was a common direction which was gradually moving the Holocaust from the margins of public memory of the Second World War towards the central place in history of Poland in the 20th century. And then it changed. Namely, this government, and especially its leader, Mr. Jarosław Kaczyński, have a very strong opinion about the past, and he is one of the most skillful players in the memory field. Actually, for me, illuminating was a book written many years ago by two American political scientists who wrote about the 2009 anniversary of the 1989 revolutions in Eastern Europe. They compared various memory policies of various politicians across Eastern Europe, and they found that two politicians stood out with a very different strategy than others. And that was the strategy of deliberately inciting controversy, inciting strong emotions, and especially emotions of resentment, to capitalize on these emotions and then win. And these two people were Mr. Orban in Hungary and Mr. Kaczyński in Poland. And that was 2009. And at that time, and up to about 2018, Mr. Kaczyński party was very careful when dealing with the Holocaust and the Polish Jewish history. Actually, they wanted to show they were a modern, enlightened group of nationalists. They are patriotic, but not anti-Semitic. However, the inner dynamics of radicalization gradually pushed them towards the right. And this culminated in this 2018 new law on Holocaust complicity and various smaller or major decisions that they made later on. One of them kicked me off the museum in 2019, or led to the dismissal of some of my colleagues from the Institute of National Remembrance, a major government-funded institution dealing with the memory of the Second World War. So instead of really sophisticated discussions we had in early 2000s or about 2015 still, now we are thinking how to protect the autonomy of academia, how to defend the academic narrative of the Second World War from distortions, especially from the glorifying distortions, the rosy pictures of Poles as the nation of the righteous among nations, and how to prevent long-term demoralization of the teachers, media people, which results from a very human tendency to conform, especially when the government is very generous in funding institutions that convey its propaganda line. I see that I have already exceeded by 1 minute 33 seconds the time allocated to me, so I maybe stop here. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Darius. Please do place your questions in the chat. But to get things going in this part of the discussion, I wonder if, I mean, it was notable that the opposition, which was at the heart of Darius's comments, were between the popular understanding and above all the understanding of politicians and scholarly understanding. And Jennifer's remarks were, to an extent, about a conflict between the right and the left. And I just wondered if each of you could take the other's perspective and say whether it applies in any way to your own subject matter. So to what extent is there a right-left divide in the Polish situation, and to what extent does a division between scholarly understanding and popular understanding animate the debate, which in the new fascism syllabus. Jennifer, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think I mean, what's fascinating in the context of the Catechism debate and how it exploded in Germany was really the way in which left and right were thrown around sort of ad infinitum a little bit, and it got extremely messy, and it proved to be not very helpful in terms of sorting out sort of the different sides and perspectives, some of them historiographical and some of them overtly political in terms of one's activism, one's sense of the playing field today. But what I thought was actually interesting, and if you don't mind, one of the interesting parallels that I heard in Dariusz's talk was this question of the chilling effect, right? And how within authoritarian right-leaning Poland, the chilling effect, the books that weren't written, to use your metaphor, Dariusz, right? How hard it is to measure the chilling effect in terms of who is not able to participate in the public sphere. And that's an interesting parallel to what surfaced in the Catechism debate, but in a very different way. So within German liberal democracy and a free public sphere, there was still very much a sense that certain positions were not tenable, that certain people felt, that it endangered them professionally to take particular stances, especially on matters of race. And this was something that came out in the submission by Miriam Brucius, as an example. This was something that Susan Nyman, who doesn't participate in the new fascism syllabus, but she speaks to directly that, for her, a Jewish American woman to be called an anti-Semite for taking particular positions in public, right? That there is a chilling effect, even within liberal democracy, around certain hot button issues. And then the question is, what does that tell us about Holocaust memory that supposedly has helped us create a language to reinforce, this desire, this quest to understand, seriously, never again in terms of, racialized killing. So we're at this interesting impasse, not just in, far-right authoritarian regimes, but also within liberal democracies themselves. So that's an interesting parallel that I heard between our two talks, Dariusz.
Would you have any comments, Dariusz, or do you want to part?
I fully agree. There is a kind of moral pressure, which I'm missing now in Poland. I would love to see someone exerting a moral pressure on me rather than threatening to fire me from my job. So it's kind of a relative difference between the two situations. But in general, because the Holocaust became such an important reference point for all kinds of debates, this is what made it so popular and such a popular part of the popular culture. But at the same time, it poses a risk to the scholars. And second, and I stress it every time I speak about the Polish debates, is what is the arena, what is the forum for the debate? And for the past 10 years, it's no longer printed press, it's the social media. And the logic of social media is actually strengthening strong opinions, emotional, controversial opinions about anything nuanced. And third is a tendency for very moralistic approaches to understanding. What strengthens your knowledge is not necessarily the best solution. What is highly moral is the right answer. So not the truth, but the right. What is right, not what is true, is proper.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat, if I can find it, from Janine Hulk, who asks Darius, if I can make my cursor.
Oh, yes, I see it. Yes, yes. The question is about the possible impact of government's memory policy on archives specifically, the accessibility of the archives. So now the problem that we have had in the last 2 years is the pandemics. The repeated lockdowns and the museums that, instead of having 10 tables open for the scholars, they have 3, just to keep the distance between them. This has been the major problem in approaching the archives. I haven't heard about any, explicit or implicit constraints or problems made to Holocaust research in any archive. However, there is an obvious problem with one of the biggest archives in Poland, which is the archive of the Institute of National Remembrance, which, among others, holds the collection of the Main Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes, an important body from the communist period, and also from the post-war trials of collaborators. So unfortunately, I haven't been there. I haven't requested any files for a long time from these collections, but unfortunately, the Institute now has a political appointee who is, fully obedient and servilous towards the ruling party. And, just 2 months ago, he fired a very decent, outstanding historian. And among the reasons he gave written was that this person, Professor Poleszuk from Lublin, wrote an article that was controversial for him. Why? Because he presented one of the post-war anti-communist guerrilla fighters, one of the anti-communist partisans who fought against the new regime in the 1940s, as quite likely that he had been likely involved in killing of Jews during the war. And that was the official reason for dismissing this man from his job in a public institution. So if this is the mindset of the leader of this institution, I can understand that some of the archivists may be less willing to help you, although I cannot give you any specific evidence for any such change. Elsewhere, I haven't heard yet about anything.
Jennifer, you wanted to say something about social media.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this point that Darius made about social media and its, and the way that it does cater to and augment and amplify certain voices and create a platform where there wasn't one before, and even a legitimacy to certain voices over others. But I also, and I'm speaking to you now, I wear many hats, and one of the hats is that I oversee a ginormous big data project on social media and its impact in civil society, especially around far-right populism, in authoritarian spaces, but also in democracies, especially around Holocaust memory, among other things. But what's really interesting about our new fascism syllabus is that it's a public-facing, public history style project, right? It's run on a shoestring. It costs us something like $15 a year to operate. It requires the, it uses the volunteer labor of me and a couple of other people. And somehow this little bitty thing managed to actually be, taken up in some of the most venerable German newspapers. It was quite fun to see them actually try to figure out who is Jennifer Evans and what is this new fascism syllabus. So absolutely, in the hands of these awful people, it does undeniably play a role. But the good news story is that, it can be used as a force for good. And it can be generative, and it does have to be used with responsibility. But just to say, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater entirely. And I think one great example would be our colleague Dariusz Jan-Grabowski, who I adore. Makes excellent use of social media and his Facebook page to precisely get the word out about the awfulness of what he's experiencing and others in Poland. So just my appeal to not completely turn our backs entirely on what is actually a medium that reaches average everyday people in very much the same way that a museum does. And so it requires that kind of precision and care when we deal with it. That's all I wanted to say.
I don't want to close social media. I don't want to close Facebook, but I would love them to change the algorithms.
Well, I think we have consensus that we don't turn our back on social media, but unfortunately, the passage of time means we have to turn our back on this session, unfortunately, but not before I thank both Jennifer and also Darius on all our behalves for such a stimulating session talking about really urgent intellectual and also political issues of the present. So thank you both very much indeed. It's my last task, a happy task, to introduce Professor Dieter Steinert, who was earlier rightly named by Suzanne as the most long-standing member of the group of organizers of Beyond Camps and Forced Labor, to introduce Dieter and to ask him to make some concluding remarks for our evening today. Dieter.
Now it works. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So it centralized the mute and unmute, and I was unmuted. Well, yeah, 20 years ago, gosh, 20 years ago, in 2003, we had the pleasure to welcome more than 150 speakers, colleagues and friends to our very first conference on Beyond Camps and Forced Labor in the Imperial War Museum. At that time, we had no idea that we were at the beginning of a conference series that would last so long. And of course, we had no idea about online conferences at that time. And we had no idea that a virus could force us to delay one of our conferences, as it happened in 2021 last year with our 7th conference. At the moment, we can only hope that the next conference, the postponed 7th conference, will take place in January next year in the Wiener Holocaust Library and in the premises of Birkbeck colleges in London. In late spring or early summer, we organizers will meet for a discussion, and we will keep you informed, of course. At the end of this most fascinating symposium, online symposium, we would like to thank our speakers, and we would like to thank all of you at home, in front or behind your computers, whatever the perspective is. We thank Suzanne, Christine, and David, who have put the program together, and we thank the Wiener Holocaust Library and everybody behind the scenes who have made this event possible. For today, we organizers say goodbye, and we all hope that we'll see you next year in January 2023 in person or in the flesh in London. It's goodbye from Susan Bartlett, goodbye from David Feldman, from Christine Schmidt, Toby Simpson, Dan Stone, and it's goodbye from me. Take care and stay safe. Thank you. That's all, folks, for tonight.